Greetings, New Life Downtown. We're continuing our reflections on Romans 8. We've covered a lot of ground. Recently, we talked about this present pain, and we talked about what it means to wait with hope in prayer and with patience. But today we come to the question about the presence of God. Where is God actually in this in-between moment? What is God doing? Is he distant? Is he up in the sky sort of waiting for all of this to be over? Where is he? We know in the Gospels that it tells us that God in Christ weeps with us. We think of Jesus weeping when his friend Lazarus had died. We also know because of the story of the cross that God suffers with us. God in Christ suffered with us. But our passage here in Romans tells us something else. Romans 8 verse 28 says, "We know in fact that God works all things together for good to those who love him, who are called according to his purpose." God is not just weeping and commiserating with our suffering, co-suffering with us. God is also at work. But when you hear that translation that God works all things together for his good, you might think it sounds like we're saying God is the cause and he'll throw the good in with the bad, whatever will get the job done. It's why I appreciate the way the NIV puts it. The NIV says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." God is not the cause of all things, but as the sovereign one, as the one who presides over it all, he is able to work in the midst of all things. This, in fact, has been much of Paul's argument throughout the book of Romans. Paul opens up by talking about Gentile idol worship and Israelite unfaithfulness and this big crisis that faces the world as a result of both of those things. And yet Paul says, this doesn't cancel out God's ability to work. In fact, God is able to work in the midst of that. And then think about the cross itself, the worst day in human history, when the Son of God came into our world and we conspired to crucify him. Yet God did not work in spite of the cross, but he worked because of, through the cross. This is an example, the supreme example of how in all things God is working. As the text goes on in verse 29, Paul says, "Those he foreknew, you see, he also marked out in advance to be shaped according to the model of the image of his Son, so that he might be the firstborn of a large family." And here Paul talks about us being conformed to the image of his Son. What does he mean by this? You recall that in one of the earlier weeks, we talked about the significance of sonship in biblical language. Adam, the first human, is called a son of God. Israel was called God's firstborn, and Israel's king was referred to as the Son of God. To be the Son of God was to be God's representative and ruler on the earth, a vice-regent, if you will. What Paul is saying here is the thing that God is doing, the thing that God is working, is to conform us to his image, to restore us to our calling as image bearers. Why? So that we can be his partners in this work. We can be vice-regents, representatives, and rulers. The destination that God has marked out for us is to be reinstated as image bearers and representative rulers in the new creation. And then verse 30, the final verse we'll look at today, says, "And those he marked out in advance, he also called. And those he called, he also justified. And those he justified, he also glorified." Now this might sound like a string of theological jargon and terms that really have no bearing to do with our everyday life. And what does glorified even mean? Does it mean that our faces are going to shine and glow? Well, who needs that, right? Actually, what Paul has in mind when he talks about glory is the sense of status being reinstated, a sense of authority being given back to us. See, in the Bible, when glory is spoken of with human beings, it's often used in connection to authority and status. When glory is used to talk about God, it does sometimes refer to radiance, but when it refers to a human being, it's about an exalted kind of status. And so already in Romans 8, verse 17, glorification is connected to being co-heirs. That's a status thing. 18 and 21, verses 18 and 21, glory is about exalted status. And of course, earlier in the book of Romans, Romans 1, Paul talks about how humans rejected the glory that God gave them, the glory of being his image bearers and his rulers. And in Romans 3:23, our sin has resulted in us falling short of this glory. And so here now at the end of Romans 8, Paul is starting to say, look, because of what God has done in Christ, we have been set right. We have been justified. We've been called, chosen, and set right. Why? So that now we can be these image bearers who reflect his glory. It's all kind of an echo of Psalm 8, verse 4 and 6, where the psalmist says, "What is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him, yet you have made him a little lower than heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. And you've given him dominion over the works of your hands. You've put all things under his feet." The New Testament scholar Haley Jacobs says, "Our position on earth as God's vice-regents to his creation is now restored through the image of the Son of God, who reigns as God's preeminent vice-regent." Think about that for a moment. Just pause and think about that. Jesus Christ has put you back together again, restored the image of God in you, is at work in you, so that you, wherever you are, can not only reflect his image, but reflect his rule, his order, his authority. This is the glory that is being returned to you. So what's all of it for? Let's go back to that verse, Romans 8:28, and hear it now in the Revised Standard Version. "We know that in everything God works for good with those who love him and who are called according to that purpose." Isn't that amazing? Not only is God at work in all things, but he's working with us, with you, with me. Where is God? He's in the midst of all things, working with you for the good of the world. Let's welcome that work today.